Batman.
But Glasgow, where I am, is like Detroit. It's like this kind of post-industrial town that's desperately struggling to get back on its feet. But
Yeah, I was there in November, in like late November, like years ago. Well, not Glasgow, but Edinburgh. I'm assuming it's going to be a similar cold and somewhat post-industrial vibe. But I think Glasgow, just from the images I've seen, is far more industrialized. It's a much bigger city, I believe.
yeah, it's about 3 times bigger, but it had this glory period during the Victorian era where, there's lots of, I don't know, tobacco and, I don't know, slaves and things like that, bringing this enormous, like, beautiful Victorian buildings. And it's been living off that glory period, off the kind of life ever since. And yeah, it's sad, but.
Okay, I kind of see what you mean by the Detroit analogy. Yeah, Detroit's mid-century heyday still kind of lingers. It had both a lot of economic clout with the cars, but a lot of cultural clout with Motown and all of that. And so, but yeah, Glasgow. I probably saw more Glasgow in a series called Lip Service that was on, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, about gays and lesbians living in Glasgow.
Wow.
It's sort of an odd introduction to it. But yeah, it looked very overcast, very kind of lived in, somewhat dilapidated, but also quite beautiful and historical. From an American perspective, I don't really see that much history. The northeast of the U.S. has a bit of that, but so I hear what you're saying about the kind of post-industrial depression.
I need to check out Lip Service. That's
yeah, Lip Service. I can tell you that one actress in that went on to play a character named Lydia in Breaking Bad, the series with Bryan Cranston. It was made a pretty big splash. So, but yeah, the other actors are not. I think they get around a lot in kind of UK film and television, but not so much stateside.
Well, Glasgow has become a kind of stand-in for New York recently. So, in the latest Indiana Jones film, they've got a ticker tape parade of the astronauts coming home, apparently, and that's filmed in Glasgow. And Batman, the recent Batman, and Batgirl.
Really?
There's a kind of American-style grid system. That's the.
Yeah, they really went with a kind of concrete, rainy noir thing with the most recent Batman, and I think Glasgow I think might even be better for that than old New York.
Yeah.
Actually, it's funny you say that because Hamilton has become like a big film place too because it's cheaper than the States. So I've run into Guillermo del Toro in front of my house and at City Hall. He's like everywhere in the city for some reason. It's really odd.
Recently, because he's been traveling in Scotland looking for locations for a film as well. He gets around.
Yeah, see, that's what he does. He goes. I ran into him in City Hall because he was looking for a location for Shape of Water, and then finding him in front of my house was just really weird.
In front of your house? Well, that might be perfect.
Yeah, just parked in front of the house while they were filming around the corner.
He's there to tell you you've got a certain look. I just have to include you in this film.
Oh yeah, no, it's not me. It wasn't me. It was the street.
Yeah, Well, New York. I know that Toronto has been a stand-in for New York in movies. This is going to be a somewhat random example of that, but Short Circuit 2, the '80s comedy about the robot, that was filmed in Toronto, but they try to pass it off as New York. And I know that Vancouver has been used not so much for movies, maybe, but a lot of television series have been filmed in Vancouver. Not filmed.
Yeah, tons.
X-Files, out in the '90s, Outer Limits. Those are two big ones. Yeah, but when they try to pass Vancouver off as New York, it just doesn't quite resonate. It's just a little too clean, glassy in Vancouver compared to New York. But although New York has been gentrified a lot, and Manhattan is probably quite green and glassy in a lot of areas now too. But yeah, Canada, Toronto, Vancouver, those have been in a lot of TV and film and playing supposedly American cities.
Yeah, the first X-Men, they were filming part of it down the street. And I remember when I actually saw the movie and I saw the scene that they had filmed, it had like pulled me right out of my disbelief because I recognized everything about the place. It was the first time I'd had that experience with a movie. And I just kind of never really went back.
Oh, to the X-Men movies?
Yeah, no,
Oh.
I mean like just that feeling of watching a film and the whole thing is just so staged. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see. Yeah, I could imagine being just pulled out of a film, the believability or your belief no longer being or disbelief no longer being suspended based on having known the area yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess the filmmakers just expect that bit of
The classic one in Glasgow was World War Z. If you remember that film, the Brad Pitt.
Was that the Brad Pitt one? Yeah.
The zombie one, where there's like a zombie horde running through what's supposed to be Philadelphia town square, and I can literally see a pub in the corner of the screen. They didn't change it, called the Piper, and maybe that's realistic because there's probably a lot of Scots immigrants into America that are going to call things Piper, and they have Pipers, but it was very jarring for me.
See, I never would have known that. Like, I would have just taken for granted it was Philadelphia.
Yeah. Well, I guess using the Northeast, trying to pass that off as Western Europe is, it's a better choice than, choosing Phoenix and calling it Glasgow or the reverse. The Southwest and LA has a certain sun-bleached kind of look that you couldn't try to fool anyone by calling it Western Europe or vice versa. Maybe Spain, maybe parts of Spain or Portugal could be, or the depiction of such could actually be recorded in an LA area or something. California, bit like that.
Just to move it on to literature, I don't know if you've read Vladimir Nabokov's lectures on literature, but he has kind of maps of like Mansfield Park and the Dublin of Ulysses, and like he literally takes a kind of literal map of Dublin and tries to pattern on where Stephen Dedalus is walking about. I don't know if either of you have that experience with books where you have do you actually see places when you're reading?
Yes, in my head. Like, that's why I kind of prefer a little bit less description of what characters look like, because my brain just kind of fills it in. I don't need to know what color their eyes are or what color their hair is. I know what book you're talking about, though. The lectures on literature the whole thing on Ulysses was amazing. Mm-hmm. And also the Metamorphosis, that was great too.
You are all far more literary than I am. Hagulian and I, we've been chatting for a long time, and he is much more familiar with literature, and so you guys are bringing that kind of thing to this discussion. I appreciate that. But yeah, I heard you say Mansfield Park, and of course I just think of that movie with the Irish actress Frances O'Connor, maybe. So when these things come up, my first question is, did they turn that into a movie? I think it was. I can even tell you, I think that it was a Miramax film, but I don't know what it's based on too well.
I know I saw it, but I don't have any memory of it whatsoever, except that Clive Owen was in it.
Yeah. Oddly, when I was in Miami last year, I was reminded of it. There was some apartment complex there in right on Miami Beach, called Mansfield Park. So of all the things to remind me of, English literature, that's it.
Yeah, I think memory plays a kind of funny role in these things. Like, I've got lists of things I've seen, films I've seen, and books I've read. But like, if you actually put me, ask me a question of like, name a character in this book or this film, or describe what happens, I mean, who knows? Like, I don't know if, I mean, people have all these, memory tricks, spaced repetition to try and absorb more, but it's tricky. Like Hegelian was saying, oh, we might be talking about Pynchon, and I'm like, okay, right. I read 20 years ago The Crying of Lot 49 and can tell you like virtually nothing about that book, but apart from where I was, like I remember the library. I was working in a supermarket at the time, and I had this lunch hour, and I would just go to the library and read every lunch hour, and that was one of the books.
Yeah, it's like I make a case for rereading because I feel like I'll read a book and then 10 years later, just, it's like I never read it sometimes. And there are like some that I just keep going back to. Like Remainder by Tom McCarthy. I don't know if you guys have read that one. Have you read that?
Oh yeah, I mean I love that. The first. Is it first? It's the first Tom McCarthy book, isn't it? It's like the one where the guy gets hit on the head and.
Yes. And it took me like, years to figure out the ending where he's just flying in a plane, and I realized he just he ends in the same place where his story began, with stuff falling from the sky on him. But it like took me years to figure that out. But it's a book that I'll read like every 5 or 6 years because it's one of my favorites. It's something that just keeps feeling new every time I read it, and weird. And but yeah, like when it comes to like, let's say Thomas Pynchon, as you brought up. I mean, I started reading him when I was in my 20s, and I'm in my 40s now, and so I just don't even know. It's like my memory of him is like it's just a general amalgam of how I feel about his books.
Yeah.
I'd just like to announce that I'm here for the listeners' benefit and apologize for my tardy arrival. But yeah, I'm here now. So it seems that we are talking about books. And yeah, I'm reading Pynchon's V at the moment, which to give it its proper title is V period, which Pynchon was very keen to point out.
The
period is part of it. Yeah,
the letter V.
Yeah, yes, like V with full stop. So as an initial, because it kind of represents an initial, the initial of a character.
Which I can't remember because I read it like 20 years ago, and I was also stoned when I read it. So I really enjoyed it when I read it, but I just don't remember very much. Although when you posted the other day, when you posted the other day that you were reading it, I read the first few pages to kind of reacquaint myself with the vibe of it, and it's like typical Thomas Pynchon.
I think he seems to have been himself, from the beginning, really. Like some writers are very much like that, aren't they? They just kind of they start as they mean to go on, and they don't really radically change. And some other writers do kind of change quite a bit.
That phrase, "start as you mean to go on," I've heard that, and I think I've even heard it or read it in an Aphex Twin song title. What does that mean actually? What's meant by that? Start as you mean to go on.
Well, it's kind of start, like begin in the spirit that you would like to continue, I suppose. Like doing everything in the way that you'd like to be, to continue doing it.
Hit the ground running somewhat.
Yeah, maybe that's the more kind of dynamic American version, right? So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course. My spin on it would be something that sounds vaguely entrepreneurial or something. Just because it's
fast,
American way, right?
Yeah. Fast and a bit kind of violent, kind of. So yeah. No, I think a lot of these phrases, they've kind of disappeared from discourse in a way, but I do like to drop them in quite a bit, on Twitter and my Substack, because I just sort of take a bit of delight in these phrases, especially as I know a lot of my readers are sort of, foreigners, non-English speakers, yeah? So they might So I haven't come across that one before.
But
How are
I
you
like the
liking?
idea of. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask, how are you liking V?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much. I started off with, I think, as I mentioned to you, Gravity's Rainbow, which was, kind of jumping in at the deep end.
Mm-hmm.
And I do like it. Also got the companion to that. Is it Weissenberger? Stephen Weissenberg. I think he published this companion to Gravity's Rainbow in the 80s, about 88. And that kind of helps a bit. But I thought I'd like to read more Pynchon, and if I read Gravity's Rainbow first, it might kind of spoil V, because V might seem like a sort of inferior, kind of prequel or something. So maybe go back to V and maybe read in chronological order, crying of Lot 49 after that.
And do you tie it in with that 70s American paranoid, DeLillo era of writers? Like, where does he fit? Or is it because I think of him as maybe like a postmodern, in that school of John Barth and, these kind of more tricksy writers.
Right.
Or kind of Joycean writers.
Mm-hmm. But also some kind of magical realism in there, where he just. Yeah, I mean, there's a scene in Gravity's Rainbow where one of the principal characters disappears down a toilet and has a kind of a journey down the toilet, which is
Well,
not exactly real.
Not to be the Philistine here, but that reminds me of an animated film for kids called Flushed Away.
Right. That sounds kind of in the similar spirit. Yeah, but. But I love that kind of stuff, actually. I think, I've come around to it more, maybe, in my middle age. Yeah, that I just kind of like these flights of fantasy, in otherwise kind of quite serious books. Yeah, as you say, he's quite Joycean. I think Pynchon was very familiar with Joyce.
Well, he potentially studied with Nabokov, Nabokov's Cornell class. That's.
Mm-hmm. I read something about that. Yeah, and Pynchon also said he was very taken with the beats, and especially Kerouac, and On the Road. So that, I think you can see that influence as well. Maybe William Burroughs kind of influence too.
He was also like a skeleton key kind of writer for me when I was young, because when I tried Ulysses the first time and failed, I jumped to Gravity's Rainbow because, I don't know, I have brain damage maybe. And it took me, I was like 20. It took me a while to kind of penetrate into Gravity's Rainbow. But once I did, it completely blew open the doors of the literary world for me, or at least literature, not the literary world, but the literature. And when I went back to read Ulysses afterwards, I don't want to say it was a piece of cake, but it was so much easier after having read Gravity's Rainbow. And I think of it, I read Thomas Pynchon now and I laugh at, the idea that it's challenging, but only because I've been reading him and people like him for so long that I think it's distorted my brain now so that I can read stuff like that. But he definitely has that kind of a effect on you, I think, especially if you're younger and you're not really used to that level of zaniness and craziness. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think, if for those people who haven't read Gravity's Rainbow, what is maybe challenging about it is there are kind of transitions into, let's say, dream sequences or, kind of fantastical sequences or flashbacks, things like this, which are not kind of obvious, not clearly maybe sort of, flagged by Pynchon. He doesn't sort of tell you this is a flashback or something. It just kind of goes into it. So that can leave you maybe a bit disoriented if you're not sort of expecting that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when you sort of get used to it, and you get used to his style, yeah, it's not impossible. It's a bit like when I tried years ago, I think, Ballard's Atrocity Exhibition, and at first this seems like a completely bizarre and impenetrable book. But it's kind of similar to that Gravity's Rainbow in a way, in that you've got this kind of jumps or transitions between the inside of a kind of insane person's head and
Wasn't that
and the sane reality, so-called sane reality outside. But of course, for Ballard, this division is not really so unambiguous, yeah, between sanity and reality, or sanity and insanity. But
was that like a collection of short stories or an anthology or something?
yes, I think the stories originally appeared in magazines. As Ballard generally published the magazines, these stories in those days, but they were all kind of a piece, yeah, because they all featured a T character who varies a bit from story to story, but most of the time he is psychiatrist who has apparently kind of gone insane, and he's trying to find some kind of meaning in what's happening around him. And there are various other characters, kind of women, another psychiatrist who seems fascinated by the T character and wants to maybe use him for experiments and so on. Yeah, so Ballard published this as a kind of a novel, in a sense, really a collection of short stories. And apparently, when this was to be published by, I think it was Doubleday in America, the publishing house Doubleday, in 1970. I think the CEO, or anyway, somebody high up, came across this book before it was released and ordered all copies to be pulped. Because it was just beyond the pale for this person. So
What a compliment.
Yeah, I think Ballard said that very proudly.
He ordered them to all be pulped, turned
exactly.
into shredded.
Yeah. It was pornographic and completely incoherent for this particular executive. So
it's like a combination of just bizarre incoherence and then like the shock of later Lady Chatterley's lover or something like that.
Yeah, basically, you've got kind of Kennedy in there. Probably you would be, you could find offense if you were sort of maybe a conservative American in 1970. Could have found it offensive, but no, it is not incoherent. Atrocity Exhibition is not incoherent really when you know how to read it, but it's also kind of funny when you know how to read the humor. But I think all of Ballard's books really, it's got humor there. Even Crash is, I think, very funny. Which people think, this is just some kind of horror from hell, but it's actually pretty amusing if you know how to read it. But
the edition
of
the Atrocity Exhibition that I read was the research edition, which is like a group of publishers, and I think it was like a magazine that they were publishing, and they republished the Atrocity Exhibition with helpful notes and extra images. So it felt like a magazine.
Research editions, like it's made for some sort of academic study group, written with annotation and observation.
This is Vic Vale's company. Out of San Francisco. They published a brilliant book in '84, which was because they published this series of books of kind of interviews, really, with different writers, and one book was about William Burroughs, and then another was on Ballard, and this is kind of like the Bible really for Ballard fans. I think it's a wonderful book, and later they published the Atrocity Exhibition, which I have a copy of this, but it's back in Wales under the care of my parents, so I hope they don't actually find it or something.
And I think in the intro of the one that I have that Ballard wrote, he says that he wrote it like in a way that you don't have to read it like a, linear chapters or a story. So he intended for you to be able to pick it up and kind of read it anywhere, which is actually really good because the book is very intense when you're just sitting there reading it. Like, I think it's a book that I need to take a lot of breaks from.
Right. Yeah. I think he said that he wanted to somehow represent discontinuity, kind of life having become discontinuous and seemingly full of random events, which is, I think, how he felt in the 60s, really. I mean, probably, I think it was influenced by him. Almost certainly, it was influenced by his wife's death, of course. And also, he took some LSD in the later 60s. He had a very, very bad trip. Yeah, he said he had a really bad trip, and he never took it again. But it said it had an effect on him for years. And
like what did he say?
Yeah, he said that he took the LSD and he had a classic bad trip, and he put his hand up to his head. He could feel his brain, and
No.
Yeah.
he talks about screaming neurology. I have a feeling I've talked about this before. I don't know if it's on our in one of our conversations then, or maybe on the podcast with Forest, on the Forest of Symbols podcast. But I have a deja vu now. But anyway, yeah, he got this. He had this bad trip, and then he basically said, or he was kind of a bit dramatic the way he put it. He said it opened a vent of hell. So maybe this is where Crash came from, through this vent. And and it took years to close. So interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a sense that Ballard just has a glazed view on reality, that what he's presenting is somehow more objective because he's, not wanting to please anyone. Like, do we still have that sense that transgression is somehow more truthful, or I feel that's like we've had enough transgression at this point?
I don't know. It feels like transgression sets up, I think for a story, it really does a good job of setting up conflict. And I think conflict, often to get like the best stories, you need a lot of conflict, or at least like a really serious conflict. And that's kind of the role that transgression seems to have.
Well, I think a couple ways to approach transgression, right? So we're talking about maybe the necessity of transgression in a story to give one a kind of a hook or something to overcome and to create a necessary level of drama. And then, transgression in society, is it still something that's sort of a prime mover, and whether to think of something as politically valuable or not. I mean, so transgression just over the preceding decades has mostly been defined as kind of a left-wing phenomenon. Now it's moved toward right. So a couple, more than a couple ways to approach the question of transgression. It's just as a kind of general method of shocking people in ways that are sort of pre-political. Depiction of bodily fluids or sexuality, gratuitous violence. I think we have sort of, milked that. Not to get vivid with the language, but I think we have kind of gotten to a point where that's been done. I mean, remember that Jane's Addiction album, Nothing's Shocking? I mean, that was like the late 80s. It was just an album title, but it's just kind of like, well, we were already felt fairly saturated with that then. Movies would get, I don't know about books, of course, as you guys do. Movies would get more and more vivid, but it's kind of been done to death. I mean, the genre of horror porn, from like the 2000s, the Saw movies, the Saw franchise, for instance. And so anyway, I think transgression has moved into sort of murkier political territory where it doesn't leap out at you in any kind of visceral sense. But for instance, transgression now would be something like just saying something racist, even not even a particular word that is shocking, but just kind of floating a certain idea, or the other forms of transgression now that are not so kind of immediately amenable to the senses.
What was the last movie that you guys saw that like really felt transgressive and new? Like something recent in the last few years.
I had to start watching Saw 3. Saw 1 and 2 were fine, but Saw 3, I think it was like the guy starts gouging out his eye, and I mean that's kind of traditional transgressive stuff. But
Yeah.
like I don't know if there's like in the 70s the transgression was necessary because people were living in a boring society with 3 TV channels or 2 TV channels, even at least in the UK. Whereas now we have a kind of overstimulated, media ecosystem, and that maybe the transgression it's not media, and like you say, it becomes part of politics.
I was just gonna say Infinity Pool.
Well, I actually saw that movie. I did. Not a lot of people did.
You liked it? Do you say you liked it or didn't like it?
I thought it was pretty interesting.
I loved it. I mean,
Yeah.
I was really surprised by it. I thought it had like some really, really like funny, dark things going on in it, and then just dark things going on in it. But it really felt new and unique to me.
Yeah, it was. I think David Cronenberg's son directed that. Brandon Cronenberg. He also did a movie called Antiviral, and that actually has a link too. Not a strong link, just kind of an evocative link for me to the entrepreneur who's drinking his son's blood. I believe Tina, you were interested in discussing that at some point. Anyway, so
yeah.
And so anyway, yes, Infinity Pool, fairly transgressive in a way. I don't think it's a good example of transgression in a Saw sense, or but I thought it was unique and pretty good.
You mentioned about racism. Obviously that would be transgressive. But I think another kind of transgression would be kind of presenting something which isn't just nihilistic, which says, maybe there's a meaning to life. There's something which is, kind of positive and says that we don't live in, kind of meaningless universe. That there's something more. I think that would be transgressive if you could do that. I think about, for example, this used to be done in films. Yeah, there used to be some kind of, spiritual message. For example, in the Brighton Rock from the 40s, with Richard Attenborough as Pinky, who's a very evil character. You might have seen this one. So he plays a gangster, Richard Attenborough there. I think it was like 1947, maybe 8, something like this. And there's a girl who kind of falls in love with him, but she's kind of oblivious to his evil side. And at the end of the film, she's being kind of cared for by a nun. And this nun, I think she kind of keeps something from this girl about Pinky, about how evil he was, because he's dead at the end. And the final shot is actually of, I don't know, I think it might be a statue of the Virgin or something like that. I think that would be very transgressive now if you put such a message into a film.